The terms we've talked about so far break color into separate components. So let's see how these components are represented in computer software. I'll introduce you to Adobe's Color Picker. It's a very common tool, and it's used the same way across Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, and After Effects. In fact, the entire Adobe suite. So let's go up to my computer room and I'll introduce you to the Color Picker. I'm in Photoshop right now, so I've just started a new file. In my toolbox at the bottom, I see two different boxes. One is a foreground color, and just behind it is the background color. I'll click once on the foreground color, and that's how I see the Color Picker. This is my original color, my current color, and right now nothing has changed, so the new color looks exactly the same. But if I were to click anywhere in this large box, you can see that I could change the color of blue that would end up being my new foreground color if I click the OK button now. I'm not ready to do that. Let's take a look around first. I am partway across the top of this color picker, and so let's talk about what that means in terms of the hue and the saturation and the brightness. First of all, just notice that this little radial button here is beside H, which stands for hue. We'll go through these other options, the saturation and the brightness, later on. If I want to change the saturation, I have a couple of things I can do. The easiest way to change the saturation of a color is to move to the left. The left side of the color picker is less saturated. The right side of the color picker is more saturated. And the far right boundary is the most saturated that you can get this color. The far left side is the least saturated you can make a color, and actually it's essentially grayscale. All the way down, starting with white, down to black, down at the bottom. So if I start off with a fairly saturated color, I can go either direction. More saturated, bring it to the right. If I want it less saturated, choose something off to the left. Remember tones and earth tones? I can achieve that by starting, perhaps, with a saturated blue, and then moving off to the left to add gray to my original saturated color. That makes it pretty easy. If I start off with a fairly light blue, like a sky blue, I can make that saturation less just by choosing a color off to the left. I'll start down here again, and let's say that I want to create a shade. Well, if you want a shade, you add black to a color. So I'm going to go straight down. And by going down, I am adding black or creating a darker shade of the color I started off with. So I can do all of those things just by staying right here in the hue. If I decide to do this to a green, I just click here. Now I'm in the green color category, and I can do the same process I did before. So what do these things do? Well, here is a fairly dark green. I'll just click this, and it's not fully saturated, it's a little bit saturated. So let's change over to saturation and see what happens to this strip. Now it's taken that green and kind of turned this on its side a little bit. So if this had been the right-hand side of the large box before, and this had been the left-hand side, I think this would make sense that this button shows up right here. Now, if I just want to slide it back and forth, I am only changing the saturation, and I don't have any risk of actually losing the exact hue that I was dealing with before. The hue stays the same. So if I have to be careful about matching up colors, this is a great way of doing it. Same with the brightness. If I click on this brightness button, now the amount of saturation isn't going to change. Do you see how it works now? When I like my new color, I just click OK. And that becomes my foreground color. So far I've talked about individual colors, but when it comes to creating a color scheme or a color palette, other tools are more helpful. Peloton can take one individual color and, by following a series of conventions or rules, help you build a color scheme that's going to work for your project. If you've had a lot of artistic training, then you know that this is a really good place to start, but you can continue to tweak your individual colors later. If you haven't had a lot of artistic training, then these color conventions can keep you safe and let you know that your colors will work together. So let's go back to the computer room. I've come to my studio to show you Peloton.com online. It's Peletton.com. This is a great website for creating a color scheme and also doing some important testing before you go to use your colors. I'm going to start off with the first dial over here in the upper left-hand corner. This dial is for a monochromatic or a single color scheme. We've talked about monochromatic before, and so you'll see here it's listed as monochromatic, one color. And this starts off just as a default as the hue, the color circle at 0 degrees. Of course, this will go over to 360 degrees, but here is my primary color, and this color is actually represented also in the center of this circle. The colors you see on the right-hand side start off with this primary color and then build the tints coming this way and build the shades coming this way. And this is what you see over here is this color scheme. If I want to see what this would look like in a web page, I can come down to the Examples button down here. This is a really cool setup because I can click or roll over on these designs and see what the rollovers would look like. So I really appreciate the way this has been set up. I also have some options over here under Page Layout, so I can look at a white page design to see what Peloton would recommend. I can try a dark page, a positive design, or a negative design. And it also has some options for artwork and animated that I won't go through right now. Most importantly to a UX designer is a vision simulation feature down here in the lower right-hand corner. I can click on this and choose something like a colorblind simulation. Perhaps I'll choose the most common, Deuter anomaly, and I can actually see what people with this color vision problem would be seeing. I want to make sure that there's still going to be plenty of contrast between light and dark, so my values have to be substantially different so that people who can't see the actual red can still see all of the buttons and all of my text. When I'm satisfied with that, I can click on this again and come back to No Vision Simulation, and I'm back to where we were. I'll come up here and close this. And let's take a look at other possibilities within Peloton. I'll come over to the left-hand corner again, and the next button to the right has 3 dots on it, and this is for adjacent colors. With adjacent colors, I still have a primary color, but I also then have a secondary color and another secondary color in the opposite direction. And I can show you a couple of more things now that we have these colors. Within this color circle, I can click on my primary color, and if I want to make it a little bit more gray, I can shift it off to the left. Everything becomes more dull, less saturated. I can make it more saturated by bringing it over to the right, and now I'm getting some really bright colors. I'll bring it back to the center and also show you that I can increase the contrast between the lightest tones and the darkest tones by clicking and dragging this out. Or, if I want less contrast, pushing everything together. And anytime I choose, I can come over to the examples and see how this might play out within an actual web page. Am I excited about this particular combination? No, not particularly. But at least I can see what it would look like before I have somebody code that page and put it all together. I'm going to close this out. And let's take a look then at the triad, a 3-color scheme. In this case, again, we have our primary color. And by the way, I can move this primary color anywhere I want. Let's say I want a blue color as primary. Okay, swing it around here. And now this live preview gives me this color of blue. If I wanted a little bit more saturated, which I probably would, swing it over this direction. I probably want to have my lightest blue a little bit lighter, so I'm going to click and drag this all out so I get more contrast. So I can play with these kinds of colors here. You'll want to be very careful with a triadic color system that you don't pull these secondary colors so close together that they really don't give you a substantial amount of difference in these two colors. Do you see how close these are? It would be pretty hard to differentiate those on a web page. So I want to pull them out this way. I could go so far as to have the triadics 120 degrees apart from each other, or approximately so. And this is a very popular way of working with designs then. In fact, let me show you the examples for this. I'll start with a white page. And here are my rollovers. Notice that the primary color is the blue, but the secondary colors that we chose are just kind of spices. They're just added to the page in very important ways to differentiate from the primary area, but they are not overloading the entire page. In fact, they're used very sparingly, and that's a very important aspect of design. There's a dark page, and again, mostly blue, a little bit of dark gray in the background. These rollovers are very, very carefully handled as far as the color is concerned, so you're not overwhelmed with these other colors. I'll close this. Let's come to the next one. This is the tetrad color scheme. It uses 4 colors, and I find this is very popular within multimedia, particularly within motion graphics. I see this used a lot. It needs to be used very carefully because there's just so much going on. So if I were to choose a web page that was particularly busy by trying to use all of these colors in equal amounts, it would be practically unreadable. So again, you have one primary color, and then the rest of these colors are used very sparingly within a website. Let me come to the examples. I'll start with a white page, and again you can see this just barely. You just barely see these colors where they're needed, and that's all. There's still plenty of white space, areas that are not colored in. And that's the most important thing to get out of all these different possibilities, is to be careful, to be gentle. Have one overwhelming color, one that you use most, and then the rest of these are just kind of like little spices, just little bits and pieces of color. We can see it in the dark page, a positive design, and a negative design. Notice here in this negative design, it's really easy to read these lines, but let's come back to the positive design. These are the things that a UX designer has to watch for. Can you still read this? I can't. Can you read this? No. So these are when the colors start to get in the way, and you as a designer need to be aware of when this happens and change something so that this is not the design you go with. I'm going to go ahead and close this. We've gone through each of the color schemes, the monochromatic, the adjacent colors, the triad colors, and the tetrad colors, but we haven't talked about how you get your primary color into this system. This is done a little bit unexpectedly. I'm going to come back to the monochromatic. Here is my blue right now, my base RGB, and it comes in as a hexadecimal code. We haven't talked about this system yet, and we need to. Let me come over to Photoshop for a minute. In Photoshop, I have our color picker open. Here's a dark blue that perhaps came from, well, where we were working earlier. And perhaps I want to switch my primary color to a green one. Well, I can just click in here wherever I want my green color, and down here is the hexadecimal code I need. So I'm going to click and drag across this, do a Control-C to copy it. I'll come back to Peloton, and I can just click on this and do a Control-V or Command-V if you're on a Mac, paste it in, and click OK, and that changes my primary color. So that's how you choose a primary color. When is this code used? Well, it's used whenever you're going to be bringing a color into a web page or a website. So using this code, I can determine that a block of color needs to be perhaps this green, or perhaps I can find out what this color is. There it is. I can just rest my cursor over it. There is my hexadecimal code. I can place that into my CSS or in my JavaScript, and I'm set to go. The colors will be correct. When it comes to exporting these colors, you have some options. I'm going to come down to the lower right-hand corner and click on Tables and Export. Because, well, let me do something. I'm going to close this. For the benefit of demonstration, I'm going to come to the Triad color system again. And because I have these all the way across, I'm going to decide that here's my primary color of green. I'm going to come back out here, and I'm going to bring these two colors closer together. I still want a fair amount of difference, but these seem like they would be really enjoyable. I think of something citrus. I think of fresh food kind of things come to mind with these various colors. Depending on how close I come to these, there is another color system that is called split complementary. Complementary colors, as you know, means that you can go straight across the color wheel, and there really isn't that kind of a setup for Peloton. You can't choose just the complementary color. However, I can do something called a split complementary, which means each of the secondary colors is just barely across the border from that complementary. And that also ends up being a very successful combination. I'll come over here and click on Tables and Export. And now you can see the entire color scheme all put together in blocks. Each block has the hexadecimal code and an RGB value. If I wanted to use this to create a color scheme, I could do a screen capture of these colors, save that screen capture as a JPEG, and then bring that screen capture into Illustrator or into Photoshop and use my eyedropper tool to select each one of these colors and put it into a color palette. I can click on color swatches here. I can actually download that palette as an image just like that. I can do it as an ACO file. This is a Photoshop type of file that can import directly into my swatches panel. A similar type of format can be used for GIMP or as a sketch palette. So these are very helpful as well. I'll come back to color list. I can look at this and say, oh my gosh, not only do they have all of my coding done for me, but they've also commented my code as well, which is really nice of them to do. I'll come back to Peloton. And I can have this as text and plug it in wherever I need. So if I wanted to use it as JavaScript, if I needed it for some other type of formatting, here are my shades, everything that I need, my RGB values. Everything is just set up for me. It's a really nice system. I'll close this up. And hopefully you'll agree that Peloton has a lot of potential. You'll still have to be careful with how you use your different color schemes, but the ability to build a color scheme here and also do your examples and also do your visual simulations all in one place just makes Peloton a great tool for UX designers.